Mamdani-mania is sweeping the Democratic Party. As we saw in New York Democratic congressional primaries a few weeks ago, Democratic incumbents are being unseated by progressive candidates backed by New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani. In today's episode, we're talking about where the Democratic Party is headed, what it means for Republicans, and the 2028 presidential election. I'm Myra Miller, and I'm joined today by David Winston. So, David, what does the rise of Mamdani mean for the Democratic Party?
This was clearly a defeat for Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, as Mamdani's endorsed candidates beat the preferences of the establishment, that being Jeffries and Schumer, and the progressives won those seats. It also shows that clearly progressives, and specifically the Democrat Socialists of America, can win these primary races. But again, you need to realize what these seats were. Again, the Cook Report does this ranking of all the congressional districts from most Democrat to most Republican. So these three districts, just to give you a sense, one district was the 11th most Democratic district in the country. The other one was 12th, and the third one was 29th. So these weren't just simply base Democratic districts. These were like the hardcore base. But the thing that we don't know is, okay, so they can win base primaries. But what about a general election? And it is not clear at all that these candidates, these Democratic Socialists of America, that these candidates have the ability to win competitive seats. And obviously, to gain a majority in the House, you need to be able to win those.
Right. One way or the other, it's going to make things very awkward for Hakeem Jeffries and for Schumer because they're not used to this. Republicans for several years through the MAGA movement and for President Trump endorsing his candidates in primaries, they're used to seeing very volatile primaries, but Democrats less so. They seem to have a more tightly controlled party apparatus than Republicans. So this is quite a new trend for Democrats, and they're not used to this. Now, you wrote a column in Roll Call a couple weeks ago called Mamdani, Schumer, Jeffries, who's in charge? Well, that's a good question these days. So is Mamdani the new leader of the Democratic Party?
Perhaps in New York City, at least for the moment. I mean, again, the dynamic is all three of these individuals, Jeffries, Schumer, and Mamdani, are all from New York. And so clearly in that environment, for the moment, given the fact that Mamdani won all those races, he sort of has the upper hand. And Jeffries and Schumer are Democratic leaders in terms of the House and the Senate on the Democratic side. One of the challenges that particularly Jeffries is facing is that probably about 80% of the Democratic House Conference are in districts where the challenge for the sitting members, Democratic members, isn't a general election. It's from their political base. And so you have this pressure that exists in terms of, so how do they sort of fend off candidates from the left, which obviously that's where Mamdani is coming from. But winning those races didn't say anything about Mamdani's ability to win competitive races. And Jeffries and Schumer need to show that that's the case, that if you're going to build majorities, you need a different set of candidates than what Mamdani is pushing at the moment.
Mamdani seems to be taking his movement outside of New York. He said just before those primaries, he said, this is not the end, it's just the beginning. So he intends to try to grow this movement. Now, there are some Democrats who are not thrilled with these developments. One example, Democratic longtime strategist James Carville, Clinton advisor, said in terms of the rise of these socialists, this is a bridge too far. I think a lot of Democrats feel the same way that I do. Representative Josh Gottheimer, a centrist member from New Jersey, said it's a growing cancer in terms of this rise of socialism in the Democratic Party. We can't let it spread and we can't ignore it. So this momentum that's building around these Mamdani-backed candidates is not setting well with many Democrats. So does this seem to be leading toward big civil war in the Democratic Party?
When you look at what the agenda is, and it was just recently published for the Democratic Socialists of America, what they're advocating is free housing, free college, free transportation, free healthcare, defunding the police, and the elimination of ICE. And actually, this week, we saw a fundamental split emerge in terms of the policy over ending aid for Israel. There was a proposal put up to cut the $3 billion in aid for Israel. $103 Democrats, House Democrats, voted for cutting that funding, while 98 Democrats opposed it. And that's a pretty clear
Yeah.
split. And then, like, right down the middle, which is just going to create an immense amount of policy
Yeah.
challenges for the Democratic Party.
Well, many of those policies that you just named, one of those being defund the police, that's a policy that Democrats spent most of the Biden administration trying to deny that they supported. That some clearly did, but most said that's not the position of the Democratic Party. But given the rise of these socialist candidates, it's going to seem to validate that many Democrats do support that. And on the proposal about cutting aid to Israel, Democrats also have this belief that one of the big reasons they lost in 2024 was over Israel and Gaza. They believe that Kamala Harris didn't take a strong enough position on Gaza as she should. There are a lot of Democrats who believe that. Our data doesn't show that. It was much more about economy inflation, but that's a pretty widespread belief on the Democratic Party. So this pent up angst over Israel seems to be manifesting through Mamdani and socialist candidates and influencing many of the votes that we're seeing even this week.
Well, actually, to your point, in terms of the Kamala Harris dynamic, this is clearly pushing this concept that it was about Gaza was a major reason why she lost, is a validation of the Democratic Socialists. But the bottom line is the reason she lost was the economy. And there's just no question about that. But it gives you a sense of the fight of the narrative, because what that's saying is how we decide what policies we want to prioritize. Um, that is a perfect example where there's a split. One side saying it's the economy, the other one side saying it's Gaza. I mean, that's just confusion and
Yeah.
chaos at scale.
There are reports that in the last few weeks that Kamala Harris, as she is pondering about whether to make another run in 2028, that she's been meeting with representatives of the socialist movement, with the Mamdani candidates that wing the party to try to get their buy-in so that if she makes another run in 2028, that she wants to try to have them with her. That's just a report. So how widespread do you think the socialist movement is within the Democratic Party? Is it very broad based, or is it just still a function of low turnout in primaries?
I mean, it helps these Democratic Socialist candidates to have lower turnout, and AOC proved that by winning her seat by beating Joe Crowley, who was supposedly the heir apparent to Nancy Pelosi, and she only needed 17,000 votes to do that. But we're seeing it spread beyond New York City. So, for example, Democratic progressives had successes in the mayoralty race in Seattle, in Chicago, and Washington D.C., and Los Angeles. Either one of those two are likely to head that direction, and they show that they can win primaries in very, very blue areas. But it's really unclear whether they can sell socialism in competitive general election races. And Jeffries now faces this oddity
That's right.
where he's part of the establishment. And if they win the majority, it ends up being a very small majority, he's going to have to rely on literally on candidates, right? In those three districts that just happened, potentially to get enough votes to become speaker. And so that's just a recipe for chaos. And if you remember, Republicans went through that with Kevin McCarthy having
Yep.
to go through 15 votes for speaker.
Right. This makes me think about the interview that Nancy Pelosi gave back in 2019. She was speaker at the time, and she was asked about the squad and this growing movement of left wing progressives in her conference. It's a much smaller number than it is today. And she downplayed that as, oh, well, that's just five people. Well, clearly it's a lot more than five people today. Life could be about to become very complicated for Hakeem Jeffries if he were to make a run for speaker um, in early January. On the Republican side, Republicans are excited about the rise of these candidates because it helps to define that contrast that they're looking for with Democrats this fall. And they're hoping that these socialist candidates will become the face of the Democratic Party. Republicans seem to think that this is going to help them in the elections this fall. And for Republicans, Mamdani seems to be the new Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi, for probably 2 decades, was the figure that Republican campaigns would try to tie all Democratic candidates to, with some limited success. So Mamdani is going to be that new figure that could work in some cases. Others may be more difficult. So, for instance, a John Ossoff in Georgia, a more centrist candidate like an Alyssa Slotkin in Michigan, a Roy Cooper in North Carolina, Republicans would have more difficulty trying to tie them to Mamdani, but I think they're probably going to do it. So there is going to be some caution for Republicans in terms of over reliance on how they try to tie all Democrats to Mamdani. What are your thoughts on that?
First off, you said an interesting phrase there that I think is worth repeating to show how far to the left really Mamdani is, right? That John Ossoff is perceived as a centrist in contrast, right? But to your broader point, Republicans have to remember that the reason that they won in 2024 was that the electorate wanted the economy fixed, and specifically the Biden economy fixed. The Mamdani socialist agenda means creating an opportunity in terms of defining the Democratic agenda as being socialist and to the left. But the electorate says this: what have you done in terms of fixing the Biden economy? They still have to have some sort of an answer. Having said that, every time Mamdani is mentioned, there's an opportunity to present that response. But just talking about Mamdani, just as we discovered with Pelosi, that's not enough.
Republicans are still not off the hook on delivering what they were elected to do. Whatever happens with Mamdani, clearly this is where the momentum in the Democratic Party is headed. And it's not only in New York where these candidates are starting to win. Last week, we saw in Colorado primaries, Senator Michael Bennet, who was a centrist, lost a gubernatorial primary. A longtime House member, Diana DeGette, lost her seat to Socialist. So that's happening there. In Michigan, in the Democratic Senate primary, the leading candidate, Abdul El Sayed, is being touted as the new Mamdani. He espouses positions that are similar to the New York City mayor. So we are seeing more of these progressive, these socialist candidates on the rise in the Democratic Party. Where do you think all this is taking us for 2028?
I think it's unclear. The results of the upcoming election, the 2026 election, is going to create a context for a lot of this. And so, for example, if Democrats didn't win anything, what happens to the establishment leadership? If, in fact, there was a large amount of seats won, does that validate the direction that both Schumer and Jeffries were going, or does that somehow translate that the progressives say, well, the reason we did so well was because of us? So you're still going to have these sort of internal fights, but this still deals with the broader problem Democrats still have, and that is their image, the favorable, unfavorable, so poor, and particularly amongst independents. And so, as we're thinking through who they choose for the 2028 nomination, as it same thing for the Republican side, how much of an appeal do they have to independents? And there's a lot of work that the Democratic Party has to do, as there is for the Republican Party. But Myra, what's your take on it?
Well, as you pointed out, it's yet unclear whether the socialist candidates can translate success in a Democratic primary in a very blue district into more widespread wins across the country. And could Mamdani himself or a Mamdani type candidate clinch the Democratic nomination in 2028? Not clear at this point, but given the way things are going, give it 2 more years, not out of the realm of possibility that things could move in the direction. But here's what we do know, that Mamdani and the socialist movement, they're already having an impact on issue positions, votes in the House, like we saw this week, and other races across the country that are moving this way. That's where we're going to leave it this week. Thanks everyone for joining us. Be sure to check out our website for more resources at winstongroup.net. We'll be back next week. Stay tuned for more discussion.